El señor Bey fue presidente de la Comisión Federal Regulatoria de la Energía Ferc de 2015 a 2017 y comisionado de cumplimiento en la Ferc de 2009 a 2014. Anteriormente fue el fiscal federal para el Distrito de Nuevo México y profesor en la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Nuevo México. Actualmente es miembro principal de la Universidad de Duke y miembro de la Junta Asesora del Instituto de Energía y Sociedad de Irvine en el Dartmouth College. Bienvenido, señor Norman Bey.
Buenos días, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. I know it is the third day of a three-day conference. I hope all of you are doing well and energized today. I this morning had 2 cups of outstanding Colombian coffee, as well as this amazing tropical fruit smoothie, and so I feel ready to run a marathon. And thank you for inviting me to your conference and giving me the opportunity to come to Colombia. It's my first visit to Colombia, and I certainly am enjoying being in a World Heritage city like Cartagena. So thank you very much. So I see on the third day you have talks from policymakers and regulators, so clearly you have saved the best for last. So you can tell I'm a recovering regulator. And what I'd like to do today is to share with you what in the United States, the states and FERC have been doing to promote the use of renewable energy, as well as to enable ever higher amounts of integration of renewable energy onto the grid. So this is a true story. In 2010, 2011, I can recall meeting with grid operators in the United States. And they said, you know, we think we can get to 20% renewables in our system, but that's about it. Beyond 20%, we're worried about whether we can maintain the stability of the grid. Fast forward to the last 12 months in the United States. 2 regional transmission organizations, 2 RTOs, SPP and CAISO, at different points during the year have been well over 50% in terms of the amount of renewables on their system at a given point in time. MISO has also hit a figure in the high 40% range. So how does this happen? How do you integrate ever larger amounts of renewables while maintaining the reliability of the grid? First, as everyone recognizes, we're going through this period of dramatic, if not transformational change in the United States. And this graph shows you the way in which the generation mix in the United States is changing. 2016 was a historic year because for the first time, more electricity was produced from natural gas than from coal. And so that trend has continued. So there's been fuel switching from coal to gas, but as you can tell from this, the bottom kind of brownish line, there is much more renewable energy on the system. You know, so a decade ago, maybe 2% solar and wind. Now it's up to about 8%. So you can see the way in which this is changing the resources on the grid. This graph simply shows additions of capacity to the grid in the United States. You can see that from about 2010 on, most of the additions have been natural gas or renewables, but that there have also been significant retirements of coal. And this graph shows that from 2014 on, every year, at least half of the new resources added to the grid are renewables, and the remainder is natural gas. And the other development that's happening in the United States is that most of the utility scale renewables has been wind, but this is starting to change, and you're starting to see more grid-scale storage coming online. In the United States, it's just important, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just want you to recognize that the regulatory framework is very complicated. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has jurisdiction over the wholesale markets for natural gas and electricity, as well as the transmission of electricity, natural gas, and oil in interstate commerce, okay? At the state level, however, states retain jurisdiction over the distribution and retail markets. So states have jurisdiction over retail gas and electricity, as well as the distribution systems needed to move both of those commodities. So it's very complicated. You can have policies at the federal level and then very important policies at the state level, all of which go into providing the regulatory framework for energy in the United States. So here's an example. With smart meters would be something that the states essentially regulate and incentivize. If you're talking about grid-scale energy storage, that would be something that FERC enables and has to create policies that allow for the use of storage. In the United States now, there are 7 RTOs, ISOs. They serve about 2/3 of the United States. And like EXO here in Colombia, they run not only energy markets, but they also provide for the transmission or dispatch of energy. FERC regulates each of these RTO, ISO markets, except for ERCOT, which for reasons I won't get into is actually not jurisdictional to FERC. It's mainly because Texas is different, okay? All right, so why has this change been happening? Why have more and more renewables been added to the grid in the United States? I think there are a number of reasons that explain this change, this really dramatic change. One is just economics and the innovation that's occurring that's driving cost curves down. So this graph was produced by Lazard, the investment bank, and it basically shows that on a levelized cost of energy basis, utility scale wind and solar is now cheaper even than highly efficient combined cycle gas, okay? So a very important driver here is just the declining cost of renewable energy. This is reflected in a recent solicitation that Xcel, a big utility in the Midwestern part of the United States, conducted last year. And so these are responses to their solicitation. And the numbers were surprising, even to those of us who follow the energy markets in the United States. The median price for wind plus storage, so this is median, half or above, half or below, was $21 per megawatt hour, okay? For solar, it was $36 per megawatt hour. There are some important kind of caveats to keep in mind here, however. The projects are not due to come online until 2023. So to a large extent, developers are pricing in further cost reductions in their bids. These projects can also take advantage of the tax credits that are currently available in the United States. The size of the storage is not specified. We only have these numbers publicly. The renewables facilities are sited at very favorable locations where there's a lot of wind and there's a lot of sun. But this gives you an idea directionally of what's happening with respect to prices in the United States, which also then in turn explains why such a significant percentage of new resources being added to the grid are renewables. Another driver for this change is consumer preference. So at the individual level, consumers prefer renewables for a number of reasons. One is because of the economics. A second is sustainability and a desire to further sustainability goals. And then, of course, there's energy autonomy. A lot of consumers like being prosumers, where they're reducing their reliance upon the local utility. At the corporate level, a very significant development in the United States has been the commitment by some of the largest, most well-known companies in America to going 100% green. So this includes companies like Walmart and General Motors, Procter & Gamble, to companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, all of those companies. So they're committing to going 100% green, which is also then providing support for the renewable energy industry. And an example of that would be something known as the RE100. Again, actually, there are more than 100 companies that belong to the RE100 at this point. Then there are supportive state and federal policies that are assisting in the development of that consumer preference, okay? And so let's look at some of those. At the state level, 31 states have renewable portfolio standards, and these standards also provide for renewable energy credits, which have some monetary value. Some states, many, have a net metering policy that applies to rooftop solar. There are green tariffs that some utilities have put in place, given support from their regulators, that allow corporates to procure green energy from their local utility. Then states have policies and programs in place, for example, to support energy storage. Some states have put out RFPs, requests for proposals, for storage, or have required their utilities as part of their integrated resource planning to consider the use of storage. A number of states in the United States also have carbon markets, the states in New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and California. Some states have also started to provide subsidies for nuclear power known as zero-emission credits. So in the divided system that the United States has, you can see the way in which states have been very active in furthering renewable energy. At the federal level, at present, the primary policy that's helping renewables is tax credits, both the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. But there are other policies as well. There are some environmental policies that are making a difference. There's research and development that the Department of Energy does, and there are tax credits for electric vehicles. But this administration, I think it would be fair to say, has not exactly wanted to support renewables. There have been efforts to roll back the Clean Power Plan, as well as to withdraw from the Paris Accord. In addition, there have been efforts on the policy side to bail out the coal industry. So the next question, I think, is a little speculative. But if you were to ask most energy experts in the United States what the future will look like over the next decade, and it's always dangerous to try to predict the future, right? I think most people would say that all of these trends are likely to continue. For sure, less coal with greater reliance on gas, particularly very flexible, fast-ramping gas. More renewables. Continuing consumer preference for clean energy when it's available. More distributed energy resources. In the United States at present, there are more than 1.6 million rooftop solar units. Okay? It's a lot of people with rooftop solar. A wider deployment of storage as it becomes increasingly cost competitive. We're already starting to see that happen across the United States. Increased energy efficiency and demand-side management. And I know that a number of people here have already been talking about DR, or demand response. I think other than energy storage, the next big perhaps game-changing technology to hit the energy space will be digitalization. Taking enormous amounts of data from sensors, sending it to the cloud, analyzing that data using advanced analytics and machine learning in a way that optimizes the performance of the grid and helps enable a far more dynamic set of resources than in the past, okay? And so I'll spend a little bit more time talking about that. And finally, greater electrification. 2016 was also a historic year in the United States because for the first time since the 1970s, more carbon emissions came from the transportation space than from the energy industry, from the power industry. And so, maybe not in this administration, but in future administrations, there will be a recognition that to really make further progress on decarbonization, you're going to have to electrify other sectors of the economy. So you have this ongoing decarbonization of the power industry that you can then leverage throughout the rest of the economy. And so you can see enormous interest on the part of car makers to develop electric vehicles, right? And utilities anxious to help make that happen because of flat or stagnant load growth, right? So you have two very important industries, I think, wanting to move in the same direction. Every major car manufacturer has announced that it intends to prioritize the development of EVs. At last report, the major car makers had committed to investing $90 billion to develop EVs. That's a lot of money. GM, for example, I think has to do this because at present, and this is not something many people recognize, GM sells more cars now in China than it does in the United States. And as China moves towards EVs, GM can't afford to be left behind. And other car makers are coming to the same realization, okay? So we'll see what happens there, but I actually think it provides great possibilities for the electric industry. To me, the really interesting question is not whether all of those trends will occur, but rather how quickly they'll happen and how sweeping the change will be. There are at least some who believe that the change will happen far more quickly than people think, even though typically change in the electric industry is not something that happens much at all, right? So there aren't any specific studies that I'm aware of that have examined that question, but let me share with you two very interesting data points. One is the Clean Power Plan, right? So in 2015, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States used the best modeling of the day to try to figure out what an achievable reduction in carbon emissions ought to be, right? And so they decided a 32% reduction from 2005 levels was the right goal that the United States should be trying to achieve, right? So giving the United States 15 years to meet that target. But in the United States, the Clean Power Plan has actually never been implemented. Litigation has resulted in a federal court issuing a stay on the Clean Power Plan. So it has never been put in effect, okay? And yet, we are 87% of the way towards meeting the goal of the Clean Power Plan, even though the plan, as I said, has been put on hold, okay? And there has been a 28% reduction of carbon emissions from 2005 levels because of all the changes in the generation mix. Changes that have been driven by a combination of economics and public policy. It's very interesting, but when you look at the Clean Power Plan and what the generation mix would have looked like under a mass-based approach, you would have had 19% nuclear, 28% coal, 32% gas, and 20% renewables In 2017, the generation mix was 20% nuclear, 30% coal, 32% gas, 15% renewable, and 2% other, or 3% other. So it gives you a sense for how the generation mix has been changing, even in the absence of additional regulation provided by the Clean Power Plan. There is one other data point I'll share with you very quickly, and that is that there is one industry out there that has the most to lose from this transition. Trillions of dollars in invested capital. Which industry? The oil and gas industry. And so it is so interesting to track the projections by the oil and gas industry on when peak oil demand will happen. There was a time not long ago, maybe a decade ago, when there was another theory involving peak oil. It was that you would hit a production level, and then because of declining oil reserves, it would just kind of drop over time. That's what peak oil used to mean. Now people talk about peak oil demand. The most forward-leaning projection is by Shell. They say that peak oil could happen between 2025 and 2030. 2025? Wow, right? That's about 6 years, a little more than 6 years from now. And so, not surprisingly, you're starting to see the major oil companies investing in power assets. Why? They're diversifying their portfolio. They're trying to hedge potential risk. At the other end of the spectrum, you have some major oil companies that have no projection at all. So over the next decade or so, it'll be very interesting to see who is right with respect to when peak oil demand happens, if it happens, right? But even if you look at BP's projection in their annual energy outlook, it's quite interesting because they model several different cases. And the key variables being economic growth, climate policy, and the EV adoption rate. But 3 of their 4 cases, so if you leave aside the base case, in 3 of the 4 cases, peak oil demand could occur by the mid-2030s. Interesting, right? Okay, so if there's one slide in my entire slide set that is actually worth hanging on to, right? Because I remember when I used to go to conferences when I was at Ferc, people would say, you know, if you go to a conference and you learn 2 or 3 things, that's a good conference, right? So this is going to be one of those 2 or 3 things for you, I hope. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States has spent a lot of time thinking about how you can integrate more renewables onto the grid. And essentially this, so it's a little bit dated, represents a map of policy options for utilities and regulators to consider in order to further that integration. The vertical axis represents cost, the cost of different options. The horizontal axis represents the type of option, the type of intervention. At the far right, you have energy storage, right? Whether that's thermal storage, pumped hydro, or chemical, i.e. battery storage, right? Then you have networks, or the use of transmission. Then flexible generation. It is almost impossible to go to an energy conference in the United States nowadays without hearing people talk about the need for flexible resources, right? The other big buzz phrase is blockchain technology. There, I've just said it. Okay. Then there's load. And in managing load as a resource, whether it's demand response at the wholesale level or at the retail level through some sort of variable pricing. Then there's the use of markets and system operations. And I really regard those 2 policy options as being very much linked with one another. Okay? So this really represents, I think, a very thoughtful attempt to map out the different options that policymakers and utilities have to integrate more renewables onto their system. So let me explore with you now each of the ways the United States has done that, each of these options, okay? With respect to markets, what is developed in the United States now in the West is something known as the energy imbalance market. So you have CAISO, the California ISO, in orange, and then you have all these other utilities in the West that have agreed to join the energy imbalance market, a real-time market meant to address variability in energy supply and demand. Why? Why did this market develop? Okay. The infamous duck curve, right? And I know you've heard about the duck curve from a number of people, so I won't belabor the point, but you can see the way in which all of that solar, both utility scale and rooftop, right? And at this point, there are many gigawatts of rooftop solar in California have created the duck curve, the belly of the duck, and then created this need for ramping in the evening hours. So you got this very steep evening ramp, right? So the EIM basically has allowed for more efficient dispatch because now CAISO and other utilities as part of the EIM can dispatch the least cost resources, right? And what this has meant is that solar energy that might have been curtailed in CAISO no longer is curtailed. It can find a home. It can find a market. This also means that because you now have both load and resource diversity across this larger footprint of the EIM, you don't have to procure as much by way of flexible ramping reserves. It is estimated that the economic benefit from the EIM since 2014, November of 2014, is more than $400 million. So you have not only a more reliable grid in the West, but you have a more efficient and economic one as well. Market rules clearly matter a lot too. One thing that now occurs throughout the RTOs in the US is that they have to provide intra-hour scheduling in 15-minute intervals. Of course, that matters because with variable resources, the amount of energy they can offer can shift from one time period to the next. Interconnection customers with variable resources have to provide meteorological and forced outage data to transmission operators, right? So that gives the transmission operator visibility into the resources that could be offered into the market. Ferc recently required renewable resources to have reactive power capability. As you know, with advances in power electronics, wind and solar facilities now can provide very high quality, very fast responding support to the grid, right, through reactive power services. And then, of course, Ferc has tried to streamline the interconnection process. You have to focus not only on the economics of developing the resources, but also getting them interconnected to a transmission system. Flexible resources. The key insight here is that not all megawatts are created equally. What you really care about are megawatts that are very, very flexible, that can respond to system variations very quickly, right? So how do you do that? Through price signals. Ferc engaged in a several-year effort to improve price formation in the RTO ISO market so that those price signals would be there. With scarcity pricing, aligning the settlement and dispatch intervals, allowing fast start pricing to set locational marginal prices, and then increasing uplift transparency, both in terms of making sure people understood where the uplift was going, but also in some instances allowing uplift to be factored into LMP. Then there's load or demand side management. In 2011, Ferc issued Order 745, allowing DR to participate in the wholesale markets. That started to happen. There was litigation, a recurring theme, it seems, in the energy space, where some power producers argued that Ferc exceeded its authority in issuing Order 745. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the United States, which upheld FERC's authority. And now DR has become a very important resource in the wholesale markets, more important in some markets than others. But in PJM, DR has provided more than 11 gigawatts of capacity in the latest auction in PJM. So really great economic benefits for consumers. And then at the retail level, and this would be in the province of the states, not FERC, an increasing number of states are exploring variable pricing. So energy storage, I've talked about a little bit, but that's one of the policy options to address the increased use of renewables. You can see here Bloomberg New Energy Finance projecting continued cost declines in energy storage, particularly as more and more gigawatt factories around the world are built and you get the commoditization of lithium-ion batteries. Footnote, we still don't know at this point in time what technology will ultimately rule the day, but for right now, it's lithium-ion. But what do you have to do if you want to enable energy storage to participate in the grid? The challenge at FERC was that the market rules were written for a very different set of resources, right? I mean, when you go back and you look at the sweep of history, for about a century, the energy markets remained little change. Same regulatory structure, same resources, all of that. Well, what do you do when you have resources that are not transmission and that are not generation, but that can provide multiple services? Like storage can be generation, it can be load, it can provide transmission services, it can provide services for energy capacity and ancillary services, right? So what do you do? FERC issued Order 841. I'm pleased to say that when I was chairman, I issued the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. It was later finalized by my successors. And this creates a participation model for storage. And there's a very important principle in it, and that is that resources should be compensated for all services that they're technically capable of providing. Okay? So that I think, was a key insight for FERC as FERC began to think about how to allow energy storage to capture all the value from the services that it was technically capable of providing. Then there are distributed energy resources. This rulemaking remains pending at FERC, but the general issue is how to allow DER, aggregated DER, to participate in the RTO markets. FERC held a technical conference in April 2018. We'll see what FERC decides to do. I think there's clearly tremendous benefit that aggregated DER can provide, but some have raised concerns about state, federal jurisdiction, and operational concerns. Can the distribution operators, the DSO, handle two-way power flows? How do you ensure that the TSO has visibility into what's happening at the distribution level? So these are issues that will have to be resolved, but I personally believe that they are manageable. We also know that DER is real and that it's happening. As an example, I mentioned the number of rooftop solar panels in the United States, but a very interesting data point from the first quarter of 2018 was that almost as much residential storage of 15.9 megawatts of residential storage was deployed as compared to 16 megawatts of utility scale storage. Right, so a lot of homeowners like the idea of having not only their own solar panels, but a storage system as well. Well, so how do you enable all of this DER, aggregated DER, to participate in the wholesale market? I think the answer is going to be provided by digitalization. And yesterday there was a reference to this pilot project that Microsoft has had with Agder Energy in Norway. But essentially what it does is it leverages the power of advanced analytics and machine learning and the data that can be transmitted, right, to the cloud to create a much more dynamic, flexible grid. And so I think if you were to try to dispatch aggregated DR manually, it would be impossible, right? But if you have software, a platform that can enable its use in a reliable way, then I think this is possible. But what are the concerns? Well, there has to be a price signal, right? Unless aggregated DER is able to participate in the grid, why would any utility invest in the software that could enable its integration? And then, while the technology, I think, is very far along, still more development has to happen. But you know, there's that virtuous cycle of innovation, deployment, and cost reduction, right? So the innovation is happening, now we have to see the deployment, and then we see the cost reduction. Then there are networks or transmission. The benefits are quite clear. They can be economic. You can have reliability benefits. There can be public policy benefits as well. Most renewables are located far from load centers in the United States. Ferc issued a big order, it's called Order 1000, a few years ago to try to promote regional planning and cost allocation for transmission. But it is still very, very hard to build transmission in the United States. NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, recently did a study in which it modeled the build-out of big transmission lines across the eastern and western interconnects in the United States. In every single model, whatever the case that they studied, the economic benefits outweighed the costs, okay? But in the United States, much as it is in virtually every country in the world, it's just hard to build a transmission because of siting issues. It's so hard, in fact, that here's a slide from 1952 in which it looks like another government agency planned the same kind of concept, creating this big, essentially power superhighway or grid across the West. And there was the rather bold statement that such a power system will inevitably come. Okay, so what are the takeaways? I think policymakers and regulators have to prepare for this high renewables future. They will have to consider which options are available and which would work best given your particular circumstances and your resources and your grid. You also have to recognize the push-pull between technology, policy, and regulation. That technology oftentimes evolves faster than regulation. Certainly, we have seen that happen in the United States with respect to energy storage and aggregated DER, right? The regulation part of things helps enable the market that sends the price signals. So again, you get the virtuous cycle of innovation, adoption, and further cost reduction. In terms of closing the gap between technology and policy or regulation, there are no silver bullets, but given the convergence of market design around the world and the same issues that I think people in every country around the world are dealing with, we can all learn from best practices in other countries. And then, of course, there's no substitute for policymakers meeting with key stakeholders and hearing from them, doing the technical conferences to figure out what the challenges and the opportunities are. I would also say that a takeaway from the United States has been harnessing the benefits of competition and markets. Every one of those options can be implemented in an effective way through a market which provides the price signals to enable the adoption of the technologies. But if you have markets, you've got to get the market design right? And there are a few principles that I think we learned at Ferc. One is removing barriers to innovation, barriers that can be posed by rules that were written for a very different era and a very different set of resources. That market rules ought to be technology neutral. We can't predict what the winners and losers will be in the markets. But if we create this level playing field and make the rules technology neutral, the most efficient resources should prevail. Then regulators can provide incentives for performance. You can create these pay-for-performance constructs. If you provide a higher quality of service, if you produce a more valuable kind of megawatt, you should be paid for doing so, right? That value should be recognized. And then, of course, transparency. Transparency is very, very helpful. And finally, I think regulators have to support policy innovation. In the United States, the states have become laboratories for experimentation. To some extent, the RTOs, ISOs have as well. Again, I think that policymakers, research institutes, and NGOs can all learn from one another. And then I would say context matters. Just because something works in another country or in another market doesn't necessarily mean that it translates well to a different market or a different country. And finally, I would say the most important thing for regulators always is to strive to do the right thing, right? And by that, I think it should be to promote an efficient, reliable, and sustainable grid. So that's both the challenge and the opportunity as we go through this very dramatic, transformative period of change. I don't know if anyone has any questions or if I even have any time left at this point, but if I do have time, I'm happy to take a question or two. Anyone? All right, well, thank you very much. It's